Thank you so much for joining us here today on Green Assistant Radio. I'm so honored to be with a fellow organizer and all around inspiring community member, Prepper Pig. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks a lot, Walker. This is really an honor for me as well.
So, what's been going on in my head for a while now when you and I first got in touch was right after Texas froze and they lost all of their municipal resources that they were so used to having, the heat, the water, being able to drive around on the roads, get gasoline, and all of these things. And I saw that that could happen anywhere, that loss of what we're so used to having every day. And so, of course, I start thinking in my head, okay, how can I prepare myself for this type of situation? And that got me exploring your content, Prepper Pig, because you have um, a forewarned is forearmed mentality, I believe, in working in the community. And so that's why I reached out to you then to come on the show. But of course, this has also evolved into the fact that war can happen anywhere. And that's something that is in the forefront of many people's minds. That resources can be cut off for any reason. And so I appreciate you coming on with me today. And I would love it if you could introduce yourself a little bit so that we know who you are and also how we can start moving forward in preparing ourselves, our homes, our communities for these moments of crisis.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that intro. And yeah, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I am a 43-year-old Afro Boricua, Black Latino man who grew up in the deep rural South. So I have a pretty unique history. And a lot of my history coming up was just being immersed in kind of, for lack of a better word, like redneck culture. I didn't know it at the time, but growing up where I grew up out in the boonies, we were basically a truly rural community. Um, I realize now that, going out and playing in the woods and, fishing in the creek and mudding and all that stuff, like we were all into that. It didn't matter your color. So I came up in that under those circumstances. And really, my first introduction to emergency preparedness came with Hurricane Hugo. And when Hurricane Hugo struck, I remember very distinctly my father telling my mother, who was coming home late that evening, the evening before, fill up the bathtub with water so we'll have potable water, in case things get dicey. And my mother was, no, no, nothing's going to happen. Everything's fine. This is just going to blow over. It's just going to be a bad storm. And sure enough, our community was without water for about 3 days. And we were without electricity for close to 3 weeks. So having that water would have really come in handy. But one of the things that I learned from that whole experience, those weeks, was, my father was in a wheelchair. He is in a wheelchair, but he was in a wheelchair at the time. We had a lot of concerns about his mobility and being able to get him actually out of the house in case things went wrong. And they did. We had a pine tree crash through our kitchen roof. So, and it wasn't fully, it just landed on top of the house and a big branch came down into the roof,
Mm-hmm.
right through the light fixture, if you can believe it. Like, of all the places that it could have hit, it came straight through the light fixture and wound up about 2 inches from touching our kitchen table right there. But but our house was crisscrossed with trees. There was debris everywhere. There was so much that we couldn't even get my father out of the house. But our community instantly sprang into action, thanks to amazing neighbors. People came and literally cut my father out of the house so that he could get out and kind of survey the damage, and we could start repairing our own house. The other thing that came from that experience was around 3 days in was when we realized the electricity probably wasn't coming back, and all this stuff that we had in these deep freezers was thawing and needed to be done. So kind of, I think of it as spontaneous. I was like 9 or 10 years old at the time, but I'm sure somebody organized and said, "Hey, let's get out here." So I just remember everybody, a dozen people with grills and propane tanks and stuff, all got in the middle of the street, literally the middle of the street, and just called out, anything you have in your house, bring it out. We're going to cook it because it'll last longer if we cook it. But I remember eating the best I've ever eaten was during a natural disaster. Uh, and I remember the
It's
freedom that we had because I went to a neighbor's house, a young lady, and I went over to her house, and for breakfast she was eating an ice cream cone and a Snicker bar, and I thought, oh man, this is my kind of place. This is my kind of atmosphere.
Yeah, you're not
So
letting all that good stuff go to waste just
that's
because
right.
of a crisis, all right?
That's
But there is
right.
something to planning ahead and saying, "Okay, we got to get this done now before it goes to
Absolutely.
waste." Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So from there, I also grew up deeply involved with gun culture, and so I grew up with guns in the home. I grew up with just kind of guns around. My hometown was home to the second largest Air Force base in the country at the time. Learning that we were a direct target of Russian nuclear threat, that my town was definitely like one of the sites that would be bombed, definitely colored everything. A lot of my friends and cohorts from that time later went on to join the military. I have two brothers who went on to join the military. So that was always part of where I was. But I realized as I moved around in community with folks, especially since the 2000 teens when I got into organizing, I realized that a lot of vulnerable communities, a lot of women, LGBTQ folks, Black and Brown folks, were not going to gun shows and didn't feel comfortable talking to these guys with big, tats and Confederate flags on their trucks, and learning about guns and going out shooting and stuff. And I realized, hey, I have a lot of that experience. So why not share that? So that's how Prepper Pig was born. It was born out of a need to kind of push out all this information that I have just kind of locked in my head and say, hey, other people in my community could probably really use this. And I would rather they not have to go into dangerous situations for them to get it. So that's where I came in. I'm kind of like a liaison between these kind of right wing echelons and also these left leaning folks. I'm a father. I am a husband. I am a writer and a published author. I am also an instructor in two martial arts, Junfan Jeet Kune Do and Muay Thai kickboxing. So combat and just kind of being around just kind of a rugged kind of lifestyle has always just been where I feel comfortable. So that's Prepper Pig in a nutshell.
I really appreciate your ability to bring what you grew up in, what you've experienced, and bring it to more people because I am somebody who has never been around guns. I've shot a shotgun, 3 times at cans, and I was like, this isn't my thing. But that doesn't mean that I don't need to know more about them. And that's something that's come into my awareness recently through you, and also through our friend Jasmine Sherman, because she is pushing for
Woohoo!
more, yes, for more gun education and awareness to everyone, because I'm afraid of them. I will admit it. The idea of them scares me. And what I recognize now is fear is detrimental to my own sanity, my own survival, as well as my ability to be a con- contributing to my community. If I'm afraid of a situation because of certain things, or say because of certain people who look a certain way, right, with tattoos and those flags and stuff like that, um, I love that you're able to bring that experience to people who would never get into those situations. So thank you for pursuing what you love and what you where you feel passionate. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I will say, if I can, just a tiny bit on guns. When I hear somebody say, I'm afraid of guns or guns inspire fear in me, I'm like, yes, that is perfect. That is exactly where you should be. Because if, like, the people who scare me the most with guns are the people who take them for granted. They're so comfortable with them that they lose kind of that fear. They lose that edge. And there's no time when I handle a gun that I'm not like concerned for my safety, for the safety of those around me. And that concern is what keeps you double checking your chamber, keeps you, making sure that it's locked away, making sure that, you haven't, you're not just so comfortable. There are people who are so comfortable that they misplace their guns. If you ever lose track of a gun, you don't need to own a gun. you know, that is the wrong mentality to have. What I will say is, and a lot of people are intimidated by gun culture, and I know that I have spoken out about this before to friends who guns are like cars, right? So if somebody says, you got that turbo carburetor with the V69, thing in the who's what's it in the dingamabob, and that is a way of gatekeeping, right? It's a way of setting up that barrier, a linguistic barrier to say, you don't know as much as I do, you know. But I guarantee you, nobody knows everything there is to know about guns. Even gunsmiths still have to, still have to go to manuals and still have to read books and still have to have charts of how guns are made. It's all kind of this show that people put on, and it's to make you think that you're not good enough and you don't have enough experience. Everybody needs a basic firearms course, and everybody needs to have a basic understanding of the family of guns. All right, and there are 5 members of this family, and if I can just quickly get into that. Okay, so first you need your sidearm, so that's going to be your pistol or your revolver. Next you need your shotgun, which I say is like that is your go-to for basically everything because the shotgun is so versatile. People say, oh, you don't have to aim. You do have to aim, and oh, all you have to do is rack the slide and you'll be good. No, people who intend you harm aren't going to be afraid of that. But the fact that you can take this one weapon and shoot everything from a slug that'll go through somebody's house all the way up to birdshot, which will just like pepper somebody, like won't even like kill them, it'll just sting a lot. And that you have a couple dozen options in between, that is really useful. So getting good with the shotgun. So pistol or revolver sidearm, shotgun, you need a short range rifle. So the most common platform is the AR-15 here in the States, but that can be anything. Those are meant to shoot out to about 200, maybe at the long side, maybe 500 yards. But those are good, just not for, those aren't for home protection, okay? And they're not for hunting, all right? Let's just, okay, nobody has an AR-15 for hunting, unless you're hunting. They are made specifically to hunt boar, all right? And as Prepper Pig, please leave the boar alone. Please leave them, please leave the boar alone. They're kind animals unless you mess with them. But yeah,
Right. They're
that's
just trying to live their lives. Like we're the
right.
ones encroaching on them. Right. Right.
That's right.
And just to let everybody know and remind them, we are talking today on Green Assistant Radio with Prepper Pig, talking about how to prepare ourselves for moments of crisis. And a quick reminder that all opinions expressed on this show are those of the people who say them and not the views of Asheville FM. Okay. Back at it.
Absolutely. Okay, so you got your sidearm, you got your shotgun, you got your short rifle, you need a long rifle. All right, this is a hunting rifle. This is for taking down deer, other game animals. This is something that can shoot far out. You need to have a good working knowledge of those weapons. And then you have that fifth guy, that crazy uncle who kind of stays in the back. That's your crossbow. All right, and people don't often lump those things together, but that is the family of weapons that I say, of long range weapons, that I say everybody should at least have a command of. If you can have all five in your, in your keep, then wonderful, wonderful for you. You're prepared for a lot of things. But that crossbow is a shorter range weapon, but it is quieter than any of the others. So if there's something that, and also you can hunt small game with crossbows. I have a crossbow pistol, which I really love.
Mhm.
But yeah, so yeah, that having, you should always have a healthy respect for these weapons, because any one of them can do damage up to and including lethal damage to both you and others. And I've often said I would sooner die than have to live with the knowledge that my neglect or my overconfidence caused harm to someone else, especially a family member.
Right. And that's, you know, we're talking, specifically today about like times of crisis. And a couple of the things that you brought up while discussing this was the idea of hunting game, being able to go out and get food, because this is something that some people are very skilled at doing. And as a community, they might be the people who do that hunting. But if you don't have that community, then having the ability to do this yourself, but not only being able to go out and hunt, but that means you also need to be able to clean an animal and be respectful of, the animal life that is in your environment, because we are pushing our environment out. We are pushing the natural out of our experience. And that means that we are then at the whim of the resources provided to us. We are not able to go out and take care of ourselves. And a lot of people say, "Oh, I don't believe in hunting, right? I don't believe in it. I won't do it." Just like I'm like, I don't believe in guns, which of course I do. They're real. I've literally seen them. Okay. You don't have to believe in it. But, that idea of I don't believe in hunting is one, you don't know what you're going to do when it comes down to time of crisis. And being prepared for the having to make these decisions, it is not leaving you longing and wishing that you had planned ahead. But also, a lot of these people eat factory farmed food, right? Like they're like, "Oh, I don't believe in hunting. That's so mean to the animals." But we push them out of their own natural environment. And then we also are eating animals that are treated way worse than animals that are out living their lives. And so, you know, it's a juxtaposition that I'm very aware of because I grew up in that. I didn't believe in hunting, and still am not a fan of it, and am having to challenge my own eating habits because of this. And I love that you brought, or I appreciate, I should say, that you brought hunting into a different perspective in my mind, because this is not, again, something to be afraid of. It's not something to be against. It is a tool. Everybody gets to pick their tools. But if we don't know the tools that are available to us, then we can't do that. And that's a big part of preparing, figuring out what resources we have. And then on top of that, how do we support ourselves and support our community at the same time?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Uh, mhm.
So there is there's a lot of theory that goes into prepping, and a lot of that isn't normally touched on, but I'm going to get into a little bit of it. One is some of the myths that have to be debunked before people can really become, or before they can really have a good understanding of emergency preparedness.
Mhm.
The the first thing that I will say is, a lot of times you hear hope for the worst but prepare hope for the best but prepare for the worst, you know and I really can't stand that saying. It just grates on my nerves, because regardless of what you hope for, you should be preparing for the most likely scenarios, to from the most likely scenario to the least likely scenario. Okay. There are people, I said it many times, there are people I know personally who have full body hazmat suits because they were preparing for a global pandemic, and they were preparing for full lockdowns and shutdowns and, economic collapse and all that stuff.
Hmm.
But they don't have life insurance, you know,
Hmm.
and, full economic collapse. Yeah, that could happen. But you passing away, or someone close to you passing away, and the people who are left behind needing money to handle burial, handle care, handle keep their lifestyle going, that is 100%. That's 100% on a long enough timeline, it's gonna happen. So I'm trying to tell people, prepare for most likely to least likely, and when you do that, you wind up preparing for a lot of different things. Nobody knew what a global pandemic was going to look like, and 2 years into it, we are living through it. And I know all these people who are like, oh well, I'm just gonna bug out to my 40 acres and go hunt and live off the land and stuff. I'm like, dude, you still got rent.
Hmm.
Your kids still got to go to school, you still got to go to work. What are you doing? You
Right.
can't just jump off and leave. The vast majority of people can't.
Well, you can if you're one of the people who plans it and prepares it. There are off grid living groups in social media that I'm a part of that I enjoy seeing their journey, right? Of getting off grid. So you could, but not everybody can or would even want to. If you, that first day you made it out there, you'd be like, yo, I'm out of here, right? I'm going back home.
Right.
Mhm.
I when I look at folks, because there are lots of different kinds of preppers, and survivalists are different from doomsday preppers, which are different, or who are different from pantry preppers, as I call them. um, and a lot of it has to do with the philosophy of what they're expecting to happen and what they expect their response to be. And a lot of that is informed by white supremacy. So when I look at how um, more affluent, wider communities or wider individuals tend to look at prepping, and I compare that to brown people, people from different countries who've probably maybe had calamities happen and had to leave and been refugees. When I look at how those two different groups prep, it's very different, right? So um, on the one hand, you've got these people who are very individualistic. I'm going to go out and it's just going to be my community, or it's just going to be me living in my bunker somewhere. And that whole bunker craze, it's so funny because the whole bunker craze can directly be linked to, of all people, John F. Kennedy. JFK was the one who set that off during the Cold War, right when the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything was going on. He made a very poignant speech, which basically said, look, the United States government doesn't have the facilities to house all Americans. You may be on your own. You need to prepare in case of a nuclear strike. You need to have a bunker. And so all these people started building all these bunkers, which none of them needed to be used. Now those bunkers are being retrofitted and turned into different like hotels and different things, because that's real estate that just isn't being used. But this, you have that idea of the rugged individual. You have individualism. So I can move out to my 40 acres and my bunker, and I can be fine for years. I've seen people who live like that. All right, they're basically living in a hole in the ground, and it sucks. It must suck. It must suck for them. But I look at the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks, which I love, and there's a lot that preppers can take away from that movie. And one of the things is, I don't care how individual and how well stocked your bunker may be and how off grid you are and stuff. A an impacted tooth, a an internal bleed, you going off into the woods to do what you need to do, and you falling on a branch and piercing your side or something in a way that your meager, probably medical skills could handle.
Mhm.
Those things are deadly. Even even relatively small things are deadly when you don't have access to proper healthcare. So a lot of people, they say, oh, I need, you get, the cities are going to be death traps, and the city, you got to get out of the city, you got to go live in the country, and that a those rural communities are not as tight knit as people want to think. All right, people meet up at church on Sundays, but by and large, their lives are lived inside their doors, behind their doors, where the same kind of abuses and domestic violence and drug abuses and alcoholism, all those things are just as prevalent. All right, as we know, as we know from the opioid epidemic, right? Uh, but then you also don't have, the cities are mostly coastal, right? So where's foreign aid going to go? Foreign aid's going to go to the cities. All right. Where are the NGOs? Where are the nonprofit organizations? They're in the cities. Where are the large concentrations of church groups? They're in the cities. Where are the hospitals and all the doctors? They're in the cities. Where's all the when you need fuel to run your generators so that you can keep some type of power grid going, is that fuel going to be shipped way out to the boonies? No, it's going to be in the cities. So people say, oh, the cities are terrible. What I've found is people in cities tend to break down into their small communities, and those communities tend to start to perform mutual aid amongst themselves and start to work and network with others. There's a really great book called Paradise and Hell, which I recommend to anybody who wants to read. It's about how it's real world examples, and it takes from everything from the San Francisco fire in the 19 teens to I think they go all the way up to 9/11 and the responses to 9/11 and all the mutual aid that happened during 9/11. And it talks about the difference between how these communities are perceived and how they actually perform when calamity strikes. And what you see over and over and over again is that what we're living now, the way that we're living now, is not reality. We are, getting up, go to work, come home, watch some Netflix. Maybe you have a couple hours to work on a personal passion project, go to sleep, get up, go to work, and you do it all over again. During times of calamity, you're not going to work. You're not doing that normal routine. People are talking to one another. They're learning about one another. They're seeing who needs help. And they're doing, during the, I'm sorry, I mean, you got me going. But during the San Francisco fire, people said, oh, well, these people would be starving and the National Guard was called in to stop looting and stuff. There were almost no instances of looting. All right. That is a myth, the instances of looting. What happened was this one woman in particular opened an open air kitchen and just started cooking. And it was cooking for anybody who needed it, anybody who wanted to come, including the National Guardsmen, who their own supply lines weren't up to snuff and they weren't getting all the supplies that they needed. And where did she get all the food from? Well, she got it from other people. They brought their canned goods. They brought stuff from their garden. But the main thing was they got a bunch of meat, literally tons, thousands of pounds of meat from the meat wholesalers who knew they couldn't just jack up prices because nobody had money for that. And they also knew that if they left it, it was all going to rot. So they started donating all this meat to people. So people were actually eating and, being in community, being outside, in these tent cities in close proximity to one another. Now, that might not be so great during a pandemic, but at the time, and in most circumstances, when something like this breaks out, when calamity happens, what you see is a deep resiliency. And we see that, right? Whenever you have when that bomb went off at the Boston Marathon, right? It was the first thing the mayor gets on the news and he says, the people of Boston are resilient, and then you see that happening. The people of Phoenix are resilient. The people of Sacramento are resilient. The people of New York are resilient. Well, duh, people are resilient. Communities are resilient. They don't just break down into warring tribes, which brings me to the second myth. So there's the myth of rugged individualism. And I want to put that out there because that also ties into the great man myth, right? That you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that change is created by these individuals working against all odds. And we've been fed a steady diet of vigilante justice, the death wish and the, taken, and, I have a certain set of skills and they're, very specific. Jackass, you rely on, no, sorry, my bad. But you rely on community, you rely on the resources that you have, that everybody basically has. The other big myth is called veneer theory, which was first posited back in the 1600s by Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher, I believe. And this Dower, this dude, when you look at pictures of him, you just know he's just going to come out with some nonsense. So, so he had this idea that it's called the veneer theory, because what he posited was that mankind, we are basically animalistic, and he didn't mean that in the way of ants and bees and communities, and how, animals work in conjunction with one another, and how the wolves keep the caribou, and the deer populations down so that the trees can grow, so that the birds can return. He wasn't talking about that. He was saying that, if you just scratch the surface, if you just take away these few amenities that we have that make our lives so neat and tidy,
Mhm.
if you take those away, people will instantly turn to savages and just start, killing one another. And that fed very well into the ideas that were being posited, because this was when England and Europe were really coming into contact with a lot of different cultures around the world. And they were seeing different ways of relating to one another, different structures for society, different manner of warfare, and both war and peace were looked at differently by these different cultures. And in order to maintain that kind of white supremacy, to say, our way is the best way, we are the civilized ones and everybody else are just savages, he posited this idea that, without running water and access to fuel and, kind of this burgeoning industrial kind of culture, that people were just savages. That is probably a lot of us grew up, especially our age, came up, and at some point in your education, in your formal education, mind you, you were tasked to read The Lord of the Flies, you know? And that is a story, for those who aren't familiar with the story, it's a story of a group of young men, probably close to a dozen, maybe 10 or 12 young men from a British military boarding school, who are shipwrecked on an island in the South Pacific, a tropical island that's abandoned, and they are kind of left to them to their own devices to find food, to find shelter, and to create a society. And these boys wind up devolving into savagery pretty quickly, as a matter of fact. And they wind up, I think the culmination is one boy killing another boy, you know, and that happens right before the British ships who were looking for them reach this island, and they're like, "What are y'all doing? Why are y'all running around in loincloths? You've only been here like a week." So, so that's veneer theory, and a lot of people, our generation, I would say Gen X, Boomers, people, people probably younger than millennials, excuse me, older than millennials, probably came up with a deep dose of veneer theory. And we see it reflected in all kinds of media all over the place, right? Every time we see any kind of post-apocalyptic movie or story, everybody's, it's lawlessness, it's savagery, it's The Walking Dead, people just going after one another. The truth is very, very different about how societies organize themselves and what structures arise during calamity, as I've stated prior. But one of the things that is super interesting about that story, the very story of Lord of the Rings, is that almost at that same time, a real group of boys were stranded on a deserted island. And it was the exact opposite. They were and they were on there for, I think, 9 months. or something on this deserted island. And they formed basically an egalitarian society. They divvied up the chores and the work that needed to be done. And even one boy fell and broke his leg. And I forget her name, a famous sociologist said the hallmark of a civilized society, when you look through fossil records of human beings, is the mended femur. All right, you might say that it's tools or that it's, the bow and arrow. No, it's the mended femur, because unlike the animal world, if a mended femur is basically a death sentence if somebody isn't there to care for you, isn't there to bring you food, isn't there to help you use the bathroom in a way that's healthy for the society that's around you. So when you see a mended femur in a skeleton, in a fossilized skeleton, that tells you that that society was already pretty civilized, that they were already taking care of one another. And on this island, one of the boys had broken his leg, and another boy had set his leg and bound his leg, and his leg was healing, and it was actually doing very, very well. He was recovering perfectly fine when the authorities found this island. So you can look up that information. I don't have the name of it, but if you look up the real Lord of the Flies, I'm sure that you can find the real story, and it's really fascinating.
In fact, I'm gonna get those links and share those in our show notes for today, and that can be found at greenassistantradio.com, because I know y'all are gonna want to find out more information about this, because this is just the beginning of the idea of rewriting what we have been, I mean, indoctrinated with. That the veneer theory, that is very new to me, and I really, that is, of course, I read Lord of the Flies, right? Everybody did. In fact, a lot of people be immediately you say it and their eyes light up because they had to read it.
Yeah.
And so this also kind of makes me wonder in my head why, or not wonder, but think about why a lot of our preparation for crisis is focused on the self. It's focused on making sure that I'm okay. But like you said, something like a broken femur, I mean, if I'm stuck at my house and I can't get out to do anything, you're right, I'm gone. And so having that not really set up ahead of time, but recognizing that we are missing out on our communities, and a lot of that is being manipulated by our outside surroundings, by our interactions with social media and things like that. The ability to do things virtually rather than actually getting together in person. And so it is going to take effort to reestablish connections in community. And my pitch is don't wait until it's a crisis. Go ahead and start making those connections now. Um, Take a first aid class, right? Start preparing yourself for these unknown moments, but instead of thinking about I'm preparing for a crisis, what if you were out on a hike in the mountains and somebody had fallen, right? You never know where you might be able to utilize these things, and that's not where I'm going to put my energy learning how to set a bone. But knowing basic first aid and also knowing who in my community has these abilities to be able to do that, I think that would be high value right now, to start establishing like resources. But also what you brought into my awareness, prepper pig, is that I don't really have that much to offer to a community in a moment of crisis. And so and so that is
Not
kind of
true.
made
Not
me,
true at all. Not true at all.
thank you. But a lot of times I like to take this, know it all mentality, that, I mean, fully engulfed in white supremacy here, right? Where like, I know best, I'm a great leader, instead of the idea that we're all great leaders. We all really do have something to give. But instead of looking at it as I know it all, which I'm guilty of all the time, is okay, I know what I know, but I don't know anything in the long run. So, how do I connect with the people around me and fulfill these needs rather than thinking, oh, I must learn everything, because that can be overwhelming too.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is it can be really daunting when you look at, all the skills necessary to have a functioning society at any level, right? Uh, I'm reminded of the fall of the Roman Empire, wherein within two generations, just 40 years, all the technology, there were people living in the ruins of the Roman aqueducts and these bathhouses and all these things who had no idea how any of it worked. Had no idea how to make the water run, how to heat it, how to clean the pipes or replace them, or even manufacture some of those things.
Mhm.
So I think that a lot of times we there's a and I can't think of the name of this psychological phenomenon, but there is a phenomenon where we tend to overestimate how much we know, like how much we can actually do, um, because we're not factoring in that we are relying on other people's skills to do those things. And it's like your plumbing, right? You're not super concerned about your plumbing, even though there's probably a very finite amount of your plumbing that you can actually repair,
Right.
right? If you had a water main burst in your yard or something, you might be at a loss as to how to exactly, handle that. But we don't worry about it continually because we know that we can place a call. We know that we can call a plumber, and the plumber knows how to do it, so we don't have to know how to do it. But in our heads, we tend to think, "Oh, I've got that covered." Wherein, if no plumber shows up, you are really going to be in hot water,
Or
figuratively.
not hot water for that
Or
matter.
But to go back to something that you said earlier, leadership is a is definitely a skill, and it's one that has to be learned and one that has to be practiced. What I will say, knowing you personally through your activism and having had you as a volunteer, you possess the greatest quality of any leader, which is the ability to follow. All right. Um, I know when I talk about emergency preparation and I talk about prepping and I talk about, I sound like I know a lot of stuff. And, maybe I know more than maybe the average person, but I definitely have people I look to and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm definitely following them. You know, what they do, I'm gonna definitely do. Uh, especially on different aspects. When it comes to security, definitely my brothers. I'm definitely hitting them up and being like, yo, well, where do we need to go? What do we need to do? But that's the main thing is being a good follower is the first step to being a good leader. So don't I would say to anyone listening, don't believe that you have to step in knowing the full, you have to know all the facts and you have to be able to speak eloquently and you have to be able to argue your points and you have to be able to, fix and do and create all these things. There's no assigned seating, which is a great way to put it from a really great activist who I heard just yesterday uh, on Twitter at Socialist Dog Mom, said there's no assigned seating. Show up, just show up. Uh, and if you want to start learning about your community, show up where the community is working now. Show up to your city council meetings, show up to your school board meetings. I guarantee you'll meet other people who know less than you do, know more than you do, are there just to learn, are there to speak their minds, people who have great ideas, people who have terrible ideas. But you'll start to figure out who's who and you'll start to build, to become part of, I won't say build this community, but you'll start to become part of this community, the community that you're going to need in your town, in your city, in your neighborhood. Show up to your neighborhood association meetings. That community is the community that's going to be moving and shaking when calamity strikes, you know because they're the people who are already networked. You just have to tap in.
Mhm.
One of the great things about the pandemic, you know uh, you know uh, notwithstanding all the terribleness that has come from it, one of the good things that have come out of it is the creation of a lot of mutual aid hubs that have sprung up. I think that you can go online to mutualaidhub.org, I believe, and or you can just Google mutual aid and it'll take you to some of the top ones. But you can definitely find mutual aid hubs in your area. These are people who somebody needs diapers, somebody needs formula, somebody needs breast milk, somebody needs, and I'm doing a bunch of young kid stuff because I have young kids, but somebody needs blankets. Prepper Pig, the as an organization, which we are not a 501c3, just to put that out there. But as a company, we collect donations all year long, and then we do winter clothing drives and winter gear drives for our homeless neighbors because there's a lot of stuff that they need that they're not getting. This year, we were able to give out sleeping bags, and I was really surprised. We for the first time we gave out long johns, and those went so fast, so incredibly fast. Like people were literally sprinting over to us to get their hands on long johns. But you don't have to wait until calamity strikes to figure out who the people are who are doing this work,
Mhm.
where those hubs are already set up and how they're already functioning, and how goods and services, i.e., skills, are being shared right now. I guarantee you, in your community, stuff is being shared right now. I had the great opportunity to do a skill share with Marcel Vialot of the Habitual Bee. She is a Black beekeeper, one of the few Black beekeepers, uh, you know, state recognized beekeepers in North Carolina, and I got to teach her how to make sourdough bread, and she is teaching me how to care for bees. And maybe part of my yard eventually will be kind of a colony for her bees, so that I can have plants and stuff, and her bees can come live and can work and do their thing, and she'll come collect them when it's time and all that stuff. I'm not 100% on all the details,
Mhm.
and that's fine. That's fine. Don't think you have to be 100% and you have to know everything. A
Mhm.
lot of it is just stepping out into the void and assuming that the ground will be there to catch you. You
Mhm.
know, yeah.
I love the idea of we have a farm here in Black Mountain, North Carolina, and they do their farming in 8 different residential yards, right?
All right.
So you know that those 8 residential yards are actually managed organically, right? And if you're going to have bees in your yard, you're not spraying for mosquitoes, right? You're not putting out pesticides that are going to just be run off into our water system anyway. You're getting inflow and supporting the natural spaces within our cities. And I think that is really incredible. And you don't have to be a beekeeper. Sometimes you just have to be a, willing to
Yeah.
share space, right? And what is space? What is property, right? Like, and then, but the opportunity to also introduce that to your children and to your direct community is that bees aren't scary, right? We all
Right.
see like the theoretical, oh, bees are great. And then a bee comes around us and we're like, yeah, like get away
Ah,
from me. And so I love the idea of being able to connect people to nature even within our own personal spaces. Mhm. Because
gotcha.
without the bees, we're not eating,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
and I there are lots of different kinds of bees, but supporting our native bee populations instead of just these um, commercialized bees that are being
Mhm.
bred specifically so that, say, almond trees can produce. These bees are actually crowding out our own native populations of bees and potentially causing damage to what is a more sustainable community of bees. And so I love that idea of working with a local beekeeper. And what is their name again?
Uh, their name is Marcel Diallo,
Okay. And
and
that's going to
that
be
is
in our
the
show notes.
yeah,
Mhm.
and that's you can find them on Instagram at the habitual BEE.
Great. So we'll be sharing that out again in our show notes at greenassistantradio.com. Real quick, so while I still have you, I don't even know what all of this is going to be on the radio, what isn't. I want to just keep talking to you forever because I have so many questions written down, but I have 2 points that I kind of want to make as a white woman um, in this setting, because I am very guilty of coming in and thinking that I know what's best and coming in and trying to make it my way when really I'm stepping into somebody else's community space. Like you said, they've already connected. There are already things going on. We do not need to build our own way of doing things. We need to find ways to support others. And something I've said before that I'll say again is be careful where you are providing your energy and your resources in the community, because if these people have never experienced the situation that they are out here serving in the situation, they don't need to be the leaders that we're supporting because there are people already out there doing it. And something that kind of with this pandemic that really hit hard was when crisis happened, all of the mainstream big finance, big supported by all the nonprofits, all these resources literally disappeared for the people who needed them most. They just literally shut their doors. And those organizations are not the ones that we as individuals, in my opinion, need to be feeding. Finding the people and the mutual aids that have been out there doing it this whole time. They aren't necessarily in social media showing it off, because any governor can, or mayor can get
Mm.
on and say, we're resilient, right? But what have you done, mayor or leader, to build up this community rather than taking away all the resources and all of the items, all of the access that people need for everyday living? So I ask you, please don't just look at who's flashy. Don't do it for because it's somebody who is really rich and famous and has a lot of clout. Because you know what? If they really cared, they would be out there already giving this stuff and they wouldn't be advertising it on television because that's not what it's about when you're really looking out for your community. That's exploitation at some of its worst, especially in a moment of crisis like this. Um, but also, so did you want to say anything about that, Prepper?
You got me, yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing I will say, and you'll see this illustrated very well in that book, Paradise and Hell, the political structure, the bureaucratic structure that we find ourselves in, the governmental entities that we're around, have a vested interest in not just like not promoting mutual aid and the governance, self-governance of people, but they're directly threatened by those things. In all of these situations, you see that the response from the government is to immediately crack down on those kind of grassroots uprisings of people and that those spontaneous mutual aid hubs that form, and to try to take them over and say, okay, well, instead of your soup kitchen, now it's going to be a city run soup kitchen, and we'll decide who gets food and who doesn't get food and how resources are allocated and all that stuff. They do that because um, what happens very quickly in Calamity is people realize they don't need these folks. They don't need that structure. Now, for larger scale things, yes, absolutely. But a lot of power today is built on people's ability to kind of say yes or no to whatever it is you personally want to do in your life. And whether that's at the, at the most basic level, like your homeowners association, or that's all the way up to the government using eminent domain to take, property from Black and brown people. At every level, that system is used to make people more reliant on the system itself. And in that way they can kind of funnel tax dollars and votes and this idea of dependency, and that gives a lot of power to very few people in the society. When Hurricane Katrina happened, what you had was a lot of Black and brown people who weren't able to escape the city. Maybe they didn't have the resources, maybe they didn't have the maybe they had sick family or something that had to stay, and so they had to stay to care for them. What you had was these people crying out for aid and trying to set up mutual aid systems, and you directly had a police chief who was saying these people are savages. There's going to be mass looting and assaults and deadly violence, and he kind of unleashed officers, many of them in plain clothes, into the community with a kind of shoot anything that moves mentality. And there are numerous, and what we know from Katrina is that there are almost no instances of looting, right? And when we talk about looting, we talk about people, regardless of color or race, but we're talking about people taking things that they need, which is food, clothing, stuff to make shelter and stuff. We're not talking about somebody running into a store and grabbing a 50-inch TV. But but they were talking about looting. They're talking about people, invading people's home and these home invasions. And what we saw was, and there are numerous documented accounts um, of people from other communities forming these vigilante groups and going into these Black and brown communities and shooting Black men, especially Black men, on sight, unarmed, no Miranda rights, no, what are you doing over here? Just kill them on sight. All right. And what we also saw was that you had mutual aid groups who then formed community defense groups and got into direct standoffs with these vigilante folks who came from other communities. And they helped, the people who knew how to do it went in and helped communities kind of rally themselves and create their own defensive structures in their own community so that they could defend themselves. It wasn't, we're going to come in and we're going to shoot the bad guys for you. It was, hey, we're going to come in, we're going to help you get your tactics, get your weapons together, maybe supply you with some stuff if you need it, and then we're going to show you how to de-escalate and how to tamp down these threats. Mm-hmm. The structures that be, especially when you talk about, at the level of, say, the mayor, the structures that be are really invested in making sure that people at the local level don't have mutual aid, don't know their neighbors very well. And that's what we see here in Charlotte, right? I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And what we see here is when you take a serious issue to city council, all right, they're going to talk it to death, and they're going to workshop it, and they're going to task force it, and they're going to do all these things that don't resolve the issue, but will tax all of your momentum and all of your energy so that you just give up over time because nothing's going anywhere. And then they can say, oh, but we studied the issue and we did, a year's worth of talks and we did community, outreach and stuff. And it's like, yeah, but the issue's still here and you didn't fix it because you don't want to give us the tools to fix it ourselves. You want to eventually, when it's politically expedient for you, swoop in so that you have another card that you can play and say, oh, well, I'll do something for this group now because then they'll vote for me and I'm sure of it. Instead of doing it when it's necessary, even though it's not politically going to win you any brownie points. Anyway, right. Let me get off that high horse.
Well, that actually brings me to my second point, which was the idea of non-centralized resource distribution, right? You mentioned in a crisis, everyone is like, oh, I'm going to go out to my 40 acres, right? But all those, resources are going to be in a centralized area like cities, like the ports, right? That's why they were populated fastest, right? Whenever any expansion happens, it is coastal area that is first because that is high value property, right? Okay, so the idea of that's where all the NGOs are, that's where all the nonprofits are, that's where the serving is happening, the medical care, and it just really makes me so not sad, not angry. I don't know what this feeling is, but it makes me feel like there's got to be a way to deal with that. And the idea of medical care going out of places, um that is possible if we are able to utilize our resources well, right? But a lot of times these funds that are coming in through these big organizations or government, right? And when they get to workshop it for a year, you don't think you're paying, you don't think the money is going into that, right? Into
Mhm.
um, their dinners that they have to go discuss, their meetings before the meeting where they actually do all the discussing and then come out and finally speak publicly. Like, no, I want to know what's going on behind the scenes, right? I want to know where these resources are really going. And so I guess this is just something that's been brought into my awareness is the idea of, you know, during this pandemic in other countries, they are able to send people out home to home to provide them the medical care that they desire in that moment. And we don't have that here. We actually, people have to travel incredible distances in order to get to medical care a lot of the time. And that is time and energy and, oh gosh, that momentum that you just mentioned of having it towards, getting something done. What about momentum towards healing, right? When we have to travel an hour and a half to get to a medical appointment, and then an hour and a half home, that is not conducive to us healing, right? That is exhausting. And I believe that a lot of that is it's just because it's the way it's always been. It's the systems that are in place just have such a stranglehold on what's happening in everyday business. They get way too much credit, whether it's politicians, businesses, medical facilities. Their reach is just so wide, and nonprofits um, are notorious for taking all of the resources and not necessarily redistributing them to the community. And I'm guilty of supporting these from the inside and the outside, these organizations. And so I'm interested to explore what out here in Asheville, in Western North Carolina, we have a lot of farmers. We have a lot of people who don't live, right here in the city. And so I'm interested in what resources, what organizations are already out there doing this. So if anyone knows it, please let me know at thegreenassistant@gmail.com, because this is just the beginning of my really being a part of this community, right? I've already said that I'm new here. You know me from Charlotte, but I'm no longer not a resident. This is my new place, and I need to, I want to support it. Let's put it that way. I want to support it. Um, so, and I have to say this, I made a note to myself. Looting, the idea of looting is so infuriating because the videos that they show on the news during moments of crisis. And like I said earlier about the hunting, you don't know what you're going to do when you're hungry, when your family is asking for food, right? You don't know what you're going to do. One. Two, all that food was going to go bad in the refrigerators anyway. break in, sorry, not telling anybody to break in somewhere, but somebody breaking in to get food that is about to go bad anyway, make it make sense, make it make sense. But it's
You
a
know what?
way, it's a way for them to control the narrative about a situation, and typically about a certain group of people.
And when it comes to food, what I say is there's no such thing as stealing food. There's just liberating. You're just
Amazing.
liberating the food.
That's amazing because food is a right. Food is an
Yeah,
absolute right. Nobody should be going hungry. We have an
absolutely.
abundance, overabundance of food. We literally pay farmers to not farm through subsidies. Um, so let's redirect some of that energy, some of my anger that I now have up in my chest. Let's redirect that towards how do we support these local farms that, you know, when we had the pandemic, when the food processors were literally throwing away food, slaughtering animals because they didn't have the ability to process, and throwing that food away, literally digging holes and putting it in the ground. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Um, that let's focus on our local farms, including urban farms in Charlotte. There's a ton of urban farms in Charlotte. Like, how do we support them now so that when crisis comes, they have the ability to scale up? Right? They have the ability. We know who those farmers are. We know where to go get the food resources for said open air kitchen, right? To feed the people, because we cannot be dependent upon our government structures to provide for us. They don't provide for us in the good times. Why are they going to provide for us in moments of crisis?
That's a good point.
So we are going to have to wrap it up here. But Prepper, how do people follow you, get a hold of you? What's your spiel, my friend?
Thanks for asking.
Mhm.
People can find me on Instagram at Prepper Pig, and you can find me on YouTube also at Prepper Pig. And I believe you can also find me on Patreon, where a lot of my content goes first. And they get sneak peeks and behind the scenes. And there are things like threat assessments, which I put out basically a newsletter that kind of runs down what I see coming up. As far back as November, I was telling people about the supply chain crisis and the inflation that was going to continue. Yesterday, the Fed voted to raise interest rates by 0.25%, and they're going to do so every couple months going forward. That is has a pretty high chance of leading us into recession, especially if anything else, any other exacerbating circumstances arise, like further supply chain problems, another wave of pandemic, of COVID. There was an earthquake in some country, I forget where, but there was an earthquake that has disrupted the creation of chips that go in vehicles. So now there's going to be more disruptions to the vehicle supply chain, just all these things. Not to mention crazy truckers, quote unquote protesting, um, and on and on and on. So if you want to kind of follow along some of my thinking, you can come along to Patreon and support me there. I'd love to have you.
You and I are going to have another conversation because I have 2 pages of notes of questions to ask you. And it all comes from your YouTube content, which is out there for anyone. So please go give them a follow, a subscribe, whatever it's called. And actually, we're going to be sharing at least part of this on our YouTube at The Green Assistant. So if you're interested in seeing more interview, because not all of this is going on the radio, then you can find that at The Green Assistant. And Prepper Pig, I really appreciate your energy and your expertise and your wisdom. Thank you for sharing it with us today. And I hope you have a
You
beautiful
too. Thanks for
day.
having me. This has been great. Can't wait to talk to you some more.